was really thrilled to see what Dr. McDougall talked about and to be able to follow up, because I feel that I have some additional information and a unique perspective that will fill in some of the spaces in some of the things that he said. So my background is in microbiology. I used to work for Big Pharma. And when I first started doing this work, not the pharma work, I left that. When I first started doing the work I'm doing now, which is educating about plant-based diets, that was about 25 years ago that I started doing this. And after I'd been doing it about 10 years, something really bizarre started to happen. I noticed for the first time sort of a new information that was coming into the realm of nutrition education and ideas out there. And it was information that totally contradicted the best science I had seen and what I believed and what I had found to be true so many times. And I started thinking, am I living in a parallel universe? How can the science all be saying these things? And I know so many people that have personally experienced that science to be accurate and relevant, and yet there's this sort of growing world that has a completely opposite perspective. What's going on? And that is what my talk today is going to be about. And you know what? Is this make sure? Yes. Okay. So, how many people here are familiar with the blue zones and have heard this idea? Okay, so let me recap really quickly. There are 5 areas in the world that scientists have extensively studied because the populations there have an extremely large number of people who live into old age and with great vibrance and vitality and health. And these 5 places are, one's in California, one's in Italy, one's in Costa Rica, one's in Greece, and one's in Japan. And there's actually been a book written about them called The Blue Zones, trying to understand what characteristics the people in these 5 places might share in common, what might be responsible for their health and longevity, and longevity extending into old age. Now, there's many factors that have been tied to health and longevity in later years. Not all of them are about what you eat and nutrition, although that is a very, very big piece of it. But when they have looked at the nutrition aspect of it and tried to figure out, so what is it about their diets that these 5 might have in common, there have been 2 main factors that recur over and over in all these places. The first is that the people in these places overwhelmingly consume far lower amounts of protein in their diet than is common in America. And the second factor they all have in common is that beans, vegetables, and whole grains are cornerstones of their diet. So what I want to do is just to take a few minutes to just sort of broadly do a review of what we do know, what the best science suggests on health and nutrition. Because we're going to need to make sure we all understand that before I go on and explain to you what I think is going on right now. So first of all, if there's one food that is most connected, one food group most connected with health and longevity, you know what it is? It's legumes, beans. Beans, peas, lentils, legumes. And in fact, Dr. Michael Greger has a fabulous 5-minute video on this I'd really encourage you to check out. It's called Increasing Lifespan with Beans, I think is the title of it. And he actually says in there, if you want to make sure you don't live long, what one food should you eliminate? Beans. So keep this in mind because there's many popular diets right now that are advocating just that you eliminate beans. And that's why I wanted to make this point. But some of the benefits that we do know about beans are that people who switch out meat for beans have reduced cholesterol levels. We know that it normalizes hemoglobin A1C, and I don't know if this was totally clear from what Dr. McDougall was saying. You want to have a low hemoglobin HbA1c. You want it to be low, but it's how you get it there that makes a difference. If you're getting it there through drugs, that is not associated with improved benefits. If you're getting it there through diet, it is. We know that in many different countries looked at, the largest, biggest studies, they all found that across the board, beans were most associated with increased lifespan. Now, when we look at meat, there's also a lot of really good science about meat and health. And by multiple different mechanisms, we know that meat has a lot of problems for people's health and longevity. The first is that animal protein specifically, that's not just the fat that's problematic, but the animal protein can actually initiate damage to the arteries and begin the process of building up plaques on arterial walls. We know that the fats in animal foods contain the single most pro-inflammatory fatty acid known, arachidonic acid, and it's not found in any plant foods. We know that animal foods contain endotoxins. These are little pieces of specific bacterial cells that also rev up inflammation in the body. We know that the higher you eat on the food chain, meat, dairy, and eggs, that you're increasing your exposure to all the major environmental toxins, some of which, like PCBs, that increase up the food chain, also promote inflammation. We know that if the meat is not cooked well enough, you're at risk of dying from a lot of foodborne illnesses. And we know that if you cook it well enough to make sure that's not the problem, you increase chemicals that are linked with cancer. And we also know, and this is important, there's a whole burgeoning area of scientific research right now, is talking about the gut microbiome. And if you aren't familiar with this, or you're just interested in it and want to learn more, Science Friday on National Public Radio, they have some fabulous podcasts if you go searching through them about the gut microbiome. Very exciting area of research. It's referring to sort of the whole constellation of microbes that inhabit the human gut. And it turns out that these are critical not only for our own health, but it looks like even for how our brain works, how our immune system functions, how we digest our food, how secure our gut is in preventing other food allergens getting through and sensitizing us. I mean, it just goes on and on, the things they're finding. And so our gut microbiome refers to not only the types of organisms in our gut, but the numbers of different ones of each type as well. And it also turns out that what we eat is the single most important predictor of what that population will look like. And when people eat a plant-based diet, it selects for one kind of population. And when they eat one heavy in animal foods, or even just start adding animal foods back in, it shifts that population to another one. And they have completely different effects on the body. Dairy products also come with a host of issues. Again, like meat, they are very high in environmental contaminants. They are rich in artery-clogging saturated fat and cholesterol. There are over 40 different kinds of hormones present in every drop of milk. And these hormones overwhelmingly are to support the growth of a very tiny creature to being a very massive one in 6 weeks' time, or in about 6 months' time. That is not what most humans want, right? We want to build our brain, especially of our infants. We want to build the brain, we want to build a healthy immune system. Those dairy hormones have lots of other impacts in the body as well. One of the things they can do is stimulate acne in a lot of people. We know that dairy proteins seem to increase the growth rate of many existing cancers. And we also have quite a bit of research suggesting that dairy may be a trigger for type 1 diabetes in genetically susceptible people. It's through a mechanism known as biological mimicry. There are proteins on the pancreatic cells in people who are genetically susceptible to type 1 diabetes that are very similar to a specific protein in cow's milk called bovine serum albumin. And in people who mount an immune response to this protein in cow's milk, it can cross-react and destroy the pancreas. Some of the evidence we have for this is that in newly diagnosed type 1 diabetics, we find extraordinarily high levels of antibodies to this particular protein. So, and then eggs. Eggs come with a whole slew of problems too. We know they're very high in cholesterol, which increases the risk of our #1 killer, cardiovascular disease. They also contain a lot of choline. And Dr. Greger has a lot written on choline that I'd encourage you to look into. But there's a lot of adverse consequences to choline, one of which is it makes you smell like fish, your body odor, like a fishy smell if you eat high levels of it. We know that eating even a single egg per week increases the risk of men dying from prostate cancer, and a single egg per week increases the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So given these facts that I just laid out, what the science shows about meat, dairy, and eggs, and beans, And given that some diets tend to increase meat, dairy, and eggs and limit beans, and others tend to decrease meat, dairy, and eggs and increase beans, how do you explain the fact that in 2013, paleo was the most Googled diet? That could be part of it, but I'm going to share with you today some other reasons that I think explain this a whole lot more. So, has anybody in here ever said themselves, or maybe heard somebody say, the best I ever felt was when I did a low-carb diet? Anybody ever heard that? Or maybe you've heard them also say, you know, I tried a vegan diet once and I just didn't feel so good, so I had to go back. Yes? Anybody heard that?
Yes.
From now on, if you ever hear anything like either of those sentiments, I want that to be a red flag for you. And I want you to think about the information I'm about to share with you. So, you know, how can it be that when somebody shifts their diet away from grains, legumes, starch, maybe even most carbohydrates, and eats more dairy, meat, and eggs, that they feel better? How do we explain this? Well, the really quick and easy explanation, I kind of said that. The really quick and easy explanation is when we compare the standard American diet to a paleo diet, you can see already there's some differences in the things that are being eaten. And so when people make that transition, the first things to go are usually the bread and the baked goods. And cheese, most paleo diets don't allow dairy products. So we start crossing out foods that most people in America are eating with a lot of regularity, right? It eliminates all of that, doesn't it? And if they're really serious about paleo, they're probably also getting the message that they should eat a few more greens, and if they're allowed to eat fruit, it's probably the most nutrient-dense of the fruits, the berries. And so just by making that switch, we can see there is some improvement in the diet. And that's usually the explanation that you will hear the vegan community pointing to, is that. I think it's a valid point, but I don't think it goes near far enough, and I don't think it explains fully what's going on. So let's take a look first at people who tried a vegan diet and just didn't feel as well. So when I talk with these people and I start asking questions, I started to find a few common denominators. First off, a lot of people first trying a vegan diet are doing so because they already have an inkling something's not going well in their health. In many cases, they could be in the very beginning of an autoimmune disease process or something else chronic and long-term. And so if they don't know how to do a really healthy vegan diet, and something's already been stirred up in their body and they're on that trajectory, and they try vegan and they continue to deteriorate, some of those people then say, yeah, I tried it and I just got worse. Well, they were getting worse anyway, and if they didn't really know how to optimize their vegan diet, it probably wasn't going to do them the good that it could. So that's the first point. The second point is that there's many vegans that adopt a vegan diet purely for ethical reasons. They don't want to contribute to violence against other creatures. Well, soda pop and chips can meet that, and that's not at all healthy. So that explains a few people as well. Many people don't know that they need to be taking a sublingual B12, and this is very critical. So B12, let me just review really quickly here, is an essential nutrient for both the health of our brain and our cardiovascular system and our entire neurological system. It is not made by plants or animals. It is actually made by bacteria. And it ends up in animals' bodies because most animals eat things that are not sanitized and not made with good hygiene. They eat plants right out of the ground with some roots and bacteria on them. They drink unchlorinated water with bacteria growing in it that produce B12. So most animals get these things concentrated in their bodies, and that is why eating animal foods can be a source of B12. Our ancestors way back living in non-hygienic environments probably didn't have to worry about B12 because everything they ate was so dirty. And they didn't wash their hands after helping their babies go to the bathroom or removing diapers, and they got some B12 that way too. So there were lots of ways people could take it in, but now today living in hygienic environments, which do have many advantages for us, and drinking chlorinated water, or at least clean water, we are missing out on that. We also are seeing a big increase in a variety of gut issues that increase malabsorption. And for this reason, you can't even count on getting B12 that's swallowed anymore, because lots of people can have things that interfere with that. This is why the Institute of Medicine actually recommends everybody over the age of 50, including omnivores, have a reliable source of B12 and actually take it as a supplement. If you take it as a sublingual and let it dissolve in your mouth under your tongue, you bypass all possible gut absorption issues. And this is why I recommend people have a reliable sublingual that they take. It can avert lots of problems. But one of the other reasons that I find people sometimes don't feel well on a vegan diet is that they aren't used to the amount of food that they need to eat to have the same amount of calories. So let me just show you here. If you just compare, here is 700 calories of food. On the left, a burger and fries is about 700 calories. If you switch that out for plant foods, on the right you see that you can eat 2 bowls of lentil vegetable soup, a tossed salad with dressing, a bowl of strawberries, a side of green beans, and a side of baked sweet potato fries. That's also about 700 calories. Now for people who are about the right weight and they starting out on a vegan diet, they're used to eyeballing the amount of food they eat. And if they used to eat a burger and fries, now they might just eat lentil soup and sweet potato fries and think it's the same amount. But in fact, they're getting less than half the calories that they're used to eating. And that's like trying to operate with your tank not full. So the first thing you need to do if you're switching to a plant-based diet, because the foods are so much less calorically dense, if you're not trying to lose weight, you need to make sure that you're eating enough food. But we still haven't gotten to what I think is the #1 reason that explains why paleo is so important, and I'm going to start to edge into it now. So a lot of people, when they first become vegan, they still have families that don't know anything about veganism, and if they are trying to be supportive of their new friend or family member who's vegan, one of the first things they'll do is either look for things they're already serving that are naturally vegan, like pasta is an easy one, and some breads are naturally vegan. Or next, then they look for what can they buy at the store to replace the things they've been doing. And so since most people eat meat in some form in a lot of meals, they'll start to look for what are the meat alternatives that are vegan. And there's a whole slew of them on the market now, making it easier to eat the standard American diet as a vegan. And in many cases, these products are very high in gluten. A product called seitan, for example, a common meat substitute, it's all gluten. Almost all of these analogs are very rich in gluten. And so if a person has undiagnosed or hasn't even got a clue that gluten causes them problems and they make the switch to a plant-based diet and their friends start giving them pasta when they come to dinner or giving them these meat analogs or they're trying it themselves, they are going to start to feel worse and they will have no idea it's from the gluten. They will think it's because they cut out meat and dairy. So as I started thinking about all of this and talking to more people and recognizing what was going on, I started to think, could gluten explain people who tried a low-carb diet and actually felt better doing it? Or could it explain why some people who tried vegan felt like they couldn't stay vegan? They didn't feel as well. So in the last probably about 10 years, I've done a lot of research on this, and I'm going to share with you some of what I have now found. But as I said, if you ever hear somebody say something like, the best I have ever felt was when I followed a low-carb diet, from now on, let that be a red flag. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about my story and how I came to this in addition to just trying to help other people. So, as I said, I've been promoting plant-based diets and veganism for a very long time. My children are now 18 and 22 years old, and they have been vegan from conception their entire lives. And I remember early on, when paleo and low-carb diets were starting to become more popular, what I would hear within the vegan movement was all kinds of disparaging things about the grain bashers and how mistaken they were for holding up grains as being problematic, that grains are very, very healthy, and long-lived populations around the world have been consuming them for a long time, and I had no reason to think this wasn't true. And I would discredit credit even, in my own mind, when people shared their stories with me about going grain-free and how it helped them. Oh, they don't know what they're talking about, is what I thought. And then I had my own wake-up call. So these are my children when they were very young. And children can be kind of a wake-up call for you, right? And so in our case, I had done a lot of research in advance of having our children because we had rampant allergies on both sides of our family, and I wanted to see if we might be able to prevent some of that in our children. So I had already been doing a lot of research about pregnancy and breastfeeding and how to optimize my diet, our children's diet, to prevent some of this. Everything was going really well until baby number 2 was born. And I often joke about how, any of you know the fabulous, not fabulous, I don't know if it's fabulous, I never read it, but the popular book from the 70s called The Peter Principle, about how people rise to their level of incompetence and then they stay there. Well, number 2 was the Peter Principle for me. So number 1, everything went great. Number 2, from the moment she was born, she seemed to have some kind of distress. And as long as we walked around with her and bounced her and carried her, she was okay, she wouldn't cry, but we could never put this baby down or she started crying. And especially when I nursed her, she would often pull off and just start screaming. And I felt like something must be coming through my milk that's affecting her. And I didn't know about gluten then. I was aware that wheat caused problems for some people. And I experimented with eliminating all these things, and I couldn't see any difference. Of course, we were eating lentil barley soup several times a week, and I didn't know barley had gluten in it. I didn't know that oats could be a problem. I didn't know a lot of these things. So when I experimented, I never got any clear answers. She just always seemed to be in distress. And this went on for a long time. And somewhere, when she got to be about 3 years old, in fact, by the time she was actually really verbal, she would come up to me frequently and she would say, "My tummy hurts." But it was never so bad that then she wouldn't run off and go play. And so when we went to the doctor, I would say, she seems to have a lot of tummy aches. What could be going on? And he would check her out and look over everything, and she was a healthy-looking kid, and in every other way she was healthy and reaching milestones appropriately. And he just kept saying, this is recurrent abdominal, what do you call it, recurrent abdominal pain, he called it. Very common. He says a lot of children just somaticize the emotional field, and that's why they have it. And I thought, yeah, I'm a pretty anxious person. Come from a pretty long line of anxious family members. I thought, okay, that could explain it. But it was getting worse and getting worse. And by the time she was 8 years old, one night in the middle of the night, she woke us up crying hysterically. And her tummy was hurting really badly. Now, maybe a year or 2 before that, I had started making my family's bread from grinding my own wheat and actually adding extra wheat gluten to it to make it rise farther. And we were eating, 3 or 4 of these big loaves a week. Our whole family was all together. And her tummy aches were getting worse and worse. And this one night, she was hysterical. And I remember juicing some purple cabbage juice because I was thinking, could it be ulcers? I was reading up on things, ulcers maybe. And that was supposed to be good for that. So I gave her that. It did help a little, helped her get back to sleep. I tried some other natural things. Nothing was working. So then we started seeing other doctors. And not one person that we saw ever suggested gluten could be a problem. All kinds of other things. There was one doctor we went to, I remember when he found out that my children had been vegan all their life, he flipped out. What, you've never given them cow's milk? And he ran a whole battery of tests because he was sure she was going to be deficient in all kinds of stuff. She wasn't. She was perfectly fine, and he calmed down. But he wasn't able to help us. Nobody could help us. And he tested her for ulcers, ruled that out. Everything was ruled out. We still didn't know what was going on. She's still in pain. I was fortunate, though, to have a friend who'd gone through something similar to this with her children, and she was a little ahead of me on the curve. And she'd actually been telling me all along, maybe it's gluten. Maybe it's gluten. Have you looked into gluten? But I wasn't ready to hear until my daughter was in so much pain that I could. And so I kept, as I said, dismissing it as the grain bashing, my friend is misinformed. Finally, with nothing else to consider, I explored gluten. And that's when I found out it's in wheat, barley, rye, and oats. And I'll explain about oats a little bit more in a little while. But I had nothing else to lose, we tried it. No. She actually, before we tried it, she had found out of a lab that did a non-invasive stool test looking for antibodies to gluten in the stool. Because when people mount an immune response to it, it's in the gut first, and it's only after the gut becomes compromised enough that those antibodies will show up in the bloodstream. So conventional doctors who look for the antibodies in the bloodstream are often missing it, and especially I think in children that are breastfed a really long time and have a healthy gut to begin with, or a healthier gut and constitution, I think they're less likely to show some of the other symptoms. So anyway, so we got this stool test back and found out she was producing high levels of anti-gliadin antibodies. So that got me more intrigued, and we immediately put her on a gluten-free diet. And when we found out there was a genetic component to this, we got our whole family tested, and we were all producing high levels of these antibodies. So we all went gluten-free together, even though none of the rest of us thought we had any symptoms. We thought we were fine. Interestingly, each of us found some things that shifted when we went gluten-free that we would never have connected with gluten. And so we all went gluten-free together, which certainly made it easier. I didn't have to worry about cross-contamination in my kitchen. Our home became gluten-free. And for me, it was also important because I thought, now we can show our child, she was 8 at the time, this isn't a big deal. You know, we can all do it together. It's not a hardship. We're just going to learn a few new things. But when we first started the gluten-free diet, and I started looking for alternatives to what we've been doing, and I looked at recipes that were then available online, and I looked at packaged goods, I found overwhelmingly the gluten-free stuff had more sugar, more processed starch, more fat, especially bad fats, refined grains, synthetic ingredients, and of course dairy, egg, and gelatin. And so we were already mostly whole foods plant-based at the time. I wasn't going to go backwards. I mean, we were doing this to protect our health, right? So I started experimenting with the recipes I had been using and trying to turn them gluten-free. And as a result, I ended up writing my first cookbook, which is Get Off Gluten. It also has a little bit of our family's story and some information in it as well. The first thing, because I'd been making our own bread that I wanted to figure out how to replace, was a whole grain bread. And everything I could find at that time was either full of junk or it tasted like cardboard. And so I just thought, you know, I guess we don't really need to eat bread. So we just went bread-free because I couldn't find anything good. But somebody gave me a clue about how to make, how I might try to make a gluten-free bread using a sourdough process, starting with red grapes. The skins on red grapes naturally have some probiotics on them. And I used those to ferment some buckwheat flour. Buckwheat is not related to wheat at all, totally different plant. And I was able to make a sourdough bread out of buckwheat flour, flaxseed, and salt, baking powder, baking soda, and a little bit of chickpea flour, and that's it. And that was actually what prompted me to write a recipe book, because I felt like at that point there were no other healthy alternatives. And so that was what launched my book. So before I get a little bit more into the science of what is going on to support what I'm going to tell you here today, I want to just quickly review what we know about celiac disease. And my premise is that celiac disease what we think of as celiac disease really represents one little piece of a bigger thing called gluten intolerance. This is how I now look at it. And in fact, I think probably it won't be long before the idea of celiac disease as it's currently defined, which is flattened villi in the small intestines and presence of specific antibodies in the blood. That's the gold standard for diagnosing it. I think we're going to see that go away. I think that is a meaningless definition, and I'll explain that more in a moment. But what we now think of as celiac disease, which is meeting the criteria for those two things, the evidence is it probably began with the agricultural revolution, and we have evidence going way, way back of descriptions of people who probably had it. They didn't know what it was or what it was caused by, but people stumbled occasionally on specific diets that seemed to help specific people, or when they cut out cereal grains, people did better. We've known that for a long time. But it wasn't until 1920 that a Dr. Sidney Haas came up with something he called the banana diet, which miraculously healed people with what would later be defined as celiac disease. But it was in 1953, which, think about it, that's actually pretty recent. 1953 was when somebody actually determined scientifically that this constellation of symptoms of celiac disease was caused by wheat proteins. That was only then. And it wasn't until the 1960s that doctors had a tool to diagnose this. and that was the biopsy. And so everything we have in the medical profession really goes back to this, and these have become sort of codified as what this disease is. But we now have a lot more information that has not been well integrated into the old paradigm. And so we're kind of in flux right now. So before we really get into the science, let me just share with you the 4 things that I believe and that I'm going to express through this presentation. As I just said, I think we're on the verge of a paradigm shift. Second is that current testing methods are missing many people who actually have celiac disease. And I now have met dozens of people who've shared horrific stories with me of having celiac disease for one case 3, another case 10, some 20 years, going to doctor after doctor, including highly well-respected gastroenterologists who found it negative by all current standards and said, you definitely don't have celiac disease, you can keep eating gluten. And yet they had symptoms consistent with it. And they were getting worse and worse, developing secondary autoimmune diseases, which is a long-term consequence of untreated celiac disease. Getting sicker and sicker, in and out of the hospital. Finally, one day, a new gastroenterologist looking at the symptom picture says, boy, this sure looks like celiac disease. Let's test you again. And the people say, I've been tested 5 times, it's negative. This time the doctor finds it. Now, I know so many people now that have shared this story with me. It is clear to me that the testing is missing people who would benefit from a gluten-free diet. And that is why I actually no longer recommend testing to most people who wonder if gluten could be a cause of their symptoms. Because in one case, I was actually friends of mine who were going through this process with their little girl, and I was telling them, it looks like celiac disease. Why don't you just try a gluten-free diet? She was having ataxia, she was just falling over. Healthy 8-year-old, all of a sudden she can't walk, she's falling over. They did every kind of invasive medical test you could imagine. She's in and out of the hospital. She's getting worse and worse. They had the top pediatric gastroenterologist treating her in the entire region that they lived in. And he told them, and they kept going to him saying, you know, we have this friend, and here's what she keeps telling us, and so we think we want to just try a gluten-free diet. He said, no, do not try it. He said, that's just going to make life harder for your family. And he said, I can assure you, he said, I've biopsied your daughter twice now. He said, your daughter has a greater chance of being hit by lightning than she does of ever being positive for celiac disease. She's getting sicker and sicker. I'm pushing for them. I said, what do you just try it. Just see if it makes a difference. So finally they do. Oh, no. When they went back to the doctor the last time, he said, look, I'll test her again. He said, but I'm sure she's negative. And this time he saw it. He saw the villi. And they went to a gluten-free diet. So it stopped further progression at that point. But now she actually had structural changes to her brain. She developed a secondary autoimmune system, and she will be a very sick individual for the rest of her life because the damage continued to go. That gastroenterologist came back to my friends, and he apologized profusely. And he said, you have changed how I think about this now. And he said, I am so sorry. He said, everything I've ever been taught told me something different. He said, I just had no idea. So clearly we are in need of much better science to explain what's going on. And there's still many doctors who will say the hard science does not support broadening this definition of celiac disease yet. And they're right. We don't have really good hard science, but we have enough circumstantial and anecdotal that I'm going to present to you. So the first thing we do know is that the incidence is increasing. There's no doubt about that, and it comes from multiple lines of research. There was one study done in 2002 is when they started it, looking at about 3,000 people over the age of 55. And when they tested this population, they found a little over 2%, I've got the specific numbers up there, that were positive by biopsy and or positive by the antibodies. And they followed this cohort. 7 years later, they tested them again, the same 2 tests. And as you can see, positive biopsies and positive antibodies increased in both groups. So that's one bit of evidence that we have. The other thing we know is another study that was done, a very, very clever study. A celiac disease researcher found that there were some blood samples that had been frozen from military recruits from the 1950s. And he went back and he thought, I wonder what percentage of those military recruits were positive for the antibodies that mark celiac disease. And I wonder how that would compare to a cohort of military recruits today. And so he went and he tested the blood then and tested the people today. And whoops, oh yeah, okay. And the first thing he found was there had been a 4-fold increase in antibodies in just about 50 years, which is pretty incredible. The second thing he did is he went back and he looked at the death records he could find for anybody who had died. And he looked at the people who had been positive for these antibodies but undiagnosed, didn't know they had celiac disease. And he compared how many had died in that group to the people who had not been positive for the antibodies back then. And he found a 4-fold increase in mortality for people who had been positive for the antibodies but had no idea they had silent celiac disease. So what is gluten? So if you take grain flour and you look at the different components of it, there's starch, protein, moisture, and fats. And if you look at the protein portion, about 90% of the protein in wheat is gluten. And gluten is actually made up of 2 different protein components, gliadin and glutenin. And the non-invasive stool test that we took tested for the gliadin portion in the stool, looking for antibodies that interacted with that. Now, we don't know for sure what causes people to suddenly start having reactions to gluten. We know genetics plays a big role in it, but we've also got some twin studies that suggest that in identical twins, you don't have 100% concurrence of the illness. Some identical twins have it and some don't. And so it's thought that some of the triggers could be a bacteria or virus. Pregnancy seems to be a trigger for some individuals. Overexposure to gluten may be a role. I personally believe that genetically modified foods are playing a role in the increase, because genetically modified foods, one of the ways they are modified is to allow increased levels of the Roundup herbicide to be sprayed on them. In fact, non-organic sunflower seeds, do you know now what they do to help dehydrate them? Post-harvest, they saturate them with Roundup because they found it desiccates them. And it turns out that Roundup damages the gut and causes leaky gut and holes in it, which would increase the possibility of proteins going through the gut, and then sensitizing to additional allergies and problems. And I think there's other ways. I think genetically modified organisms most likely also will alter the gut microbiome immensely. It just makes sense. And if we know that taking antibiotics alters the gut microbiome, and many genetically modified plants are engineered to produce their own insecticide in every cell of the plant, don't you think that insecticide is going to be altering the gut microbiome? And so another possible trigger could be something that we haven't yet discovered and don't know, but we do know it's increasing. We also know that anybody with celiac disease is at increased risk of a whole host of other autoimmune diseases, additional allergies, and depression. And newer studies are suggesting that the older one is upon diagnosis of a gluten immune reaction, the more likely they are to suffer from these additional problems. And presumably that is because they're having longer exposure. Which raises another issue. There are people who have already figured out they need to go gluten-free, and they go gluten-free, and then they go to the doctor and say, yeah, I'm so much better since I went gluten-free, and the doctor says, oh, you shouldn't do that without being tested first for celiac disease. We need to know, in part, so that they know they have to be 100% gluten-free, no cross-contamination, and they don't think people will be that strict without the testing. So they tell them, go back, you've got to eat gluten for 2 weeks heavily, or else we won't be able to get a positive by our testing. And so they'll tell these people to go back and eat gluten again. And I wasn't able to find it in preparing this talk, but I did see reference to a study once that said even that 2 weeks additional exposure for some individuals increases the likelihood of secondary complications. So my recommendation is to people, if they think gluten's a problem, just go completely gluten-free. So I'm going to try to speed things up here because I think I've talked a little too long on some of these slides. So gluten sensitivity can be the great mimic because it can look like all kinds of other things. It can cause a whole host of gastrointestinal symptoms, but sometimes it causes none of those. It can cause arthritic symptoms, it can make people tired, and it very much, for some people, is linked with different forms of mental illness. In fact, the brain is one of the most sensitive parts of the body to gluten, and there's evidence that for some people, gluten triggers depression, attention deficit disorder, it can make autism worse, it can increase symptoms of bipolar. For 5% of schizophrenics in double-blind studies done in controlled environments where people didn't even know they were being put on a gluten-free diet, 5% of them had complete remission from schizophrenia. And then it relapsed when they were fed gluten and didn't even know it was happening. And for some people, gluten can trigger seizures. So there's been a lot of studies on schizophrenia and gluten intolerance or celiac disease. In some cases, they've made the connection. I just want to clarify, as I said, we have a classic definition of celiac disease right now. And then there's this bigger thing called gluten sensitivity. And neither of them is an allergy. And there have been some people who've tried to differentiate what they are. I think there's a lot of overlap too. I don't think it's really clear at this point. But neither is an allergy. As I said, the classic definition is the antibodies and the biopsy. But many people will never manifest these symptoms, or they'll not manifest them for 10 or 20 years, and so they get missed. But gluten can affect any tissue or organ in the body. Most doctors, however, still do not know that about 60% of us carry the genes to be sensitive to gluten, and that some researchers actually think 1 in 3 of us right now is already having a measurable immune response to gluten. And long-term symptoms can occur in those who have no symptoms whatsoever. And so in the absence of the kind of studies that the conventional doctors think we need, I think that because we have the evidence we do have, the anecdotal case reports, the perspective of experienced clinicians helping people, and reasonable theoretical explanations that I've laid out here that have not been well disproven, I think the burden of proof exists on those saying gluten doesn't cause harm, not on people suggesting that we go gluten-free. So there was a 2012 consensus paper that I thought was really good. This was the top researchers in the field of celiac disease meeting in the UK to try to figure out what is going on. And from the conclusion of the paper, they said, "It is now becoming apparent that reactions to gluten are not limited to celiac disease. Rather, we now appreciate the existence of a spectrum of gluten-related disorders, and all individuals, even those with a low degree of risk, are therefore susceptible to some form of gluten reaction during their lifetime." That's a pretty big change. And so gluten is found lots and lots of different places. I can talk more about this personally with you if you have more questions later. But I think it's important for those of us that are trying to help people transition to plant-based diets or looking to do so ourselves, that you realize we have something really beneficial to people who are struggling with gluten problems, because we know that inflammation is a big part of what drives gluten-related symptoms. And animal protein is inflammatory. Animal foods select for an inflammatory gut microbiome. Animal foods promote cancer, and people with celiac disease are at increased risk of certain kinds of cancer. We know that animal foods can trigger certain autoimmune diseases, and that the removal of them has stopped and even reversed some autoimmune diseases. So what if you are already vegan? Why should you want to know more about gluten? Well, as I said, gluten can help the gluten sensitive reduce their disease risk further. We can be the big tent that welcomes everybody, so if you ever do outreach or food events, make sure you have some gluten-free options, because more and more people are figuring out gluten's a problem, and if they think, oh, the vegans never have anything gluten-free, they're not likely to look at what we have to offer. Also, because there's a lot of people who are trying vegan diets because they know something's not right, but they don't know what it is. Or they're just trying it for other reasons, and they may have gluten intolerance and not know they might get more gluten if they're not careful. We need to have that information and be able to explain this to people. The other thing is that unlike almost all other chronic diseases in America, gluten intolerance and celiac disease are the only things that the medical model currently looks at and sees that diet is a proper response. And so people who have gone gluten-free for symptoms and are seeing improvement, they're in a teachable moment. They get it now, that what we eat can have huge effects on our quality of life. So So what should people replace replace meat and dairy with? It's real simple. I think you want to look at beans, you want to look at starchy vegetables, and you want to look at green, yellow, and colorful vegetables. That should be the basis of the diet right there. That's a very simple version, and a sublingual B12. That's the simplest message possible. But if you want to expound on that, you can think of something called BG Champs, which, think of it like you can be the champs. But it stands for berries, greens, cruciferous vegetables, herbs and spices, the allium family, mushrooms, pulses, beans, nuts, and seeds, beans, peas, and lentils, and nuts and seeds. Anything else that we should know? Yes. As you've heard here, oils are not a health food. We do need good fats, and you get those from whole, unprocessed plant foods. Don't use the extracted oils. There are also, so there's 3 supplements I do encourage people to look into and consider. One is B12. One is vitamin D3 if you aren't getting enough adequate sunlight. And there's a vegan version of D3 that I highly recommend because the non-vegan version actually comes from sheep. And sheep tend to be a natural reservoir for a disease called scrapie, which is probably where mad cow disease came from, by feeding sheep to cows. And there's other reasons too. And then a vegan form of DHA and EPA, which are the essential fatty acids that are often touted in fish, but fish come with all kinds of environmental toxins, not to mention most fisheries are in collapse. And so this is the one vegan version I have found widely available that does not use genetically modified organisms to produce it, and it's Ovega, and that's what I use too. So what about grains? And I told you about the grain bashing I heard years ago. I actually believe that there is evidence that grains are not the optimal food for our species. The real grain eaters in nature have a gullet, they're birds. And so I think grains have been adaptive for humans because they store so well, and they grow lots of different places, and they have allowed us to move outside of originally equatorial regions and survive. And there are many populations that have done well on them, but something is changing in our environment that is making us more sensitive to them. And there are some people with celiac disease who do not get better until they go completely grain-free. Just don't confuse grains with legumes. Legumes are powerhouses of nutrition, and we should be eating those. I think we can live fine and healthy without grains, although they're widely available. Not all grains contain gluten. Wheat, barley, and rye are the 3 big ones to avoid. Oats is the next biggest one to avoid because oats are very absorbent of gluten. So in the field, growing next to a wheat field, they absorb gluten, transported in the trucks, packaged. You can get dedicated gluten-free oats, but it turns out oats also have a molecule in them very similar to gluten. For some people, that cross-reacts as well. So oats is the next one to consider getting rid of. But if you're really curious to know if grain or gluten is causing you a problem, I encourage people to start out 100% grain-free. That'll give you the quickest evidence about whether that makes a difference for you. If you see improvement and things get better, then you can start adding the grains least likely to be a problem, which would be like quinoa, amaranth would be next, then maybe millet, then corn and rice. And if you can tolerate all of those without recurrence of symptoms, then you would just stay off of gluten and you can have the others. As I said, there's a lot of problems with testing. One is that you have to go back to eating gluten, and that can cause more problems for some people. The other is that many people who are gluten-free are negative by all available tests. And so, as I said, the quickest answer is just to try a completely grain-free diet. And you can make all of these foods here, vegan and grain-free. So who should consider gluten-free? If you've got any family members that are known to be gluten sensitive, if you've got autoimmune diseases or gastrointestinal cancers in your family, if you've got allergies, ADD, depression, lactose intolerance, those can also be suggestive that gluten might be an issue, and any symptoms that you can't find a cause for. Whoops. And, okay. I'll tell you what's really weird. I'm seeing the same, I'm sorry.
There it is.
Okay, I'm thrown by what I was seeing here for a minute. So, and also iron deficiency, irritable bowel syndrome, infertility, and thyroid disorders are strongly suggestive that gluten could be a contributing factor. And I want to share with you a paper that I found, and again, I have not found any medical doctors that even know about this paper, but I thought it was really, really good, and really makes a strong case about how ineffective our testing is. So this was a clinic that specialized in treating refractory iron deficiency anemia. This is anemia so severe that the only way they can treat it and get people's iron levels up is to keep giving them blood transfusions. And so they wanted to see if gluten would make a difference for these people. So they took 100 consecutive patients coming into the clinic with this really, really awful form of iron deficiency anemia that nothing would treat them. And they put them on a completely gluten-free diet. And before they did that, they did a whole bunch of different testing on them. This is what was interesting. And so they found that 5% of them were positive for the antibodies specific for celiac disease diagnosis. They found that 13% of them had the flattened villi. And they found that 2/3 of them carried the genes that are believed to be necessary in order to have celiac disease. So that still leaves probably 1/3 of the people in the study that were negative by all of these tests, right? And yet, 92% of these patients recovered from their iron deficiency anemia on a gluten-free diet. So that is strongly suggestive that all of our testing methods are missing a lot of people who would benefit from going gluten-free. Now, what if everything I've said does not apply to you or anybody you care about? Right? What if you're sure gluten isn't a problem, you have absolutely no symptoms, none of these predisposing factors? Why should you care about what I'm saying? So this is a comparison of the carbon footprint of different types of diets. At the bottom there in the dark green, you have, and so this is actually looking at how far could you drive a BMW for the greenhouse gases that would be produced. And so relative to diet. So like if you were eating the standard American diet, it's like you're driving a BMW about 4,200 or 4,700 kilometers in terms of the carbon footprint in it. If you go organic on the standard American diet, you can cut your carbon footprint a little bit. If you cut out meat, but you're still eating dairy and eggs, you can knock it in half, and you can see both conventional and organic. But when you go 100% plant-based, your carbon footprint is a fraction of the standard American diet. This is more powerful than your transportation. And there's water scarcity issues. I mean, this is the amount of water that goes into a single serving, and I translated it to gallons on the side there. The bottom 3 items are plant foods, the top 3 are animal foods. Look how much water it takes to produce the animal foods, because you've got to have all the water that feeds the animals that produce those foods, and the water that grows the crops that are fed to those animals. And the water and environmental problems are so big that the United Nations actually said in their 2006 report, livestock are one of the most significant contributors to today's most serious environmental problems. Urgent action is required. And World Watch Institute said that it's the human appetite for animal products that is driving virtually every category of environmental destruction. So when we see people around us who don't have this information and they think they need to go gluten-free or on a paleo version or low carb and they're getting some benefit, there are huge ramifications for every single one of us because people have that perspective. And food insecurity is another big issue, and while lack of the inability to provide food for everybody on the planet is not the only thing driving food. I mean, we actually can produce enough food for everybody on the planet. There's other issues involved. But a lot of what happens is land in poor areas gets used to grow feed crops for animals of rich Westerners, and the local people don't have access to it to grow plant foods to just survive. So our diet affects food insecurity too. But the most important reason why I follow a plant-based diet, in addition to being gluten-free, is because it is my personal statement that I will not turn a blind eye to injustice against others considered less worthy. And if you look throughout human history, every example of a human-caused tragedy on this planet was enabled to happen for exactly one reason. And it was because individuals like us good people who thought they were doing good things in general in life, were able to discount some subset of the population by saying, well, they're different from us in this way, so we don't need to include them in who we consider worthy of concern. You know, we look at how America was taken from native populations. We look at how women who wanted the right to vote were treated. We look at internment of Japanese Americans. You look at the Tuskegee experiments. In every case, I don't believe the people who stood by and saw those or perpetuated those were bad people, but they were people who had been taught by culture and tradition not to see certain injustices. And so veganism is the way that we start to wake people up and to make a difference by expressing, this is my value, and it changes people. And so, if you're interested, I did bring, whoops, I flew, so I didn't bring very many, but I've got a few copies of my book. They're $15 if anybody's interested in getting one. And I thank you very much.